Dennis Lynn Rader was born on March 9, 1945 in Pittsburgh, Kansas, the oldest of 4 sons to William and Dorothea Rader. His early childhood appeared, on the surface, to be an ordinary one. His family was working class, and his father held demanding jobs that kept him away from home for long hours. His mother managed much of the household duties and spent long days raising the children. To neighbors and relatives, the Rader household seemed typical of small-town America in the 1940s and 1950s, disciplined, modest, and quiet. Yet beneath this outward appearance, the seeds of something far darker were already forming within Dennis. From a young age, Dennis felt neglected by his parents, particularly by his father, who was largely absent due to work. The lack of emotional closeness left him feeling isolated. Psychologists who later studied his case pointed to this sense of neglect as one of the early factors that may have contributed to the development of his abnormal desires. By the time he was in grade school, Dennis was already showing troubling signs. He admitted in later confessions that as a boy, he developed violent fantasies involving power, control, and bondage. He would capture and kill small animals, often torturing them first. Forensic psychologists recognize this behavior, animal cruelty in childhood, as one of the most common early indicators in individuals who later commit violent crimes. At school, Dennis appeared shy and unremarkable. He was not academically strong and struggled in his studies. Teachers described him as quiet, withdrawn, and easily overlooked. Socially, he was awkward and rarely stood out among his peers. This blend of invisibility and hidden inner cruelty created a dangerous foundation. Someone who could pass as ordinary while harboring disturbing secrets. He often fantasized about tying up women, imagining scenarios of control and domination that went far beyond normal childhood curiosity. These fantasies became stronger with time, feeding his inner world as he entered adolescence. During his teenage years, Rader worked small jobs, including one as a grocery store bagger, and spent time in the local community much like any other boy his age. Outwardly, there were no clear warning signs to those around him, but in his private moments, he admitted later, his fantasies grew darker. He would cut out images of women from magazines and draw ropes or bindings on them, imagining them in positions of helplessness. This secret world became his most powerful escape from reality and planted the blueprint for the crimes he would commit decades later. After graduating from high school in 1963, Dennis tried to find a sense of identity. He enrolled at Kansas Wesleyan University, but performed poorly and dropped out after just 1 year. In 1966, he joined the U.S. Air Force, hoping to gain structure, discipline, and direction. His time in the military took him far from Kansas, including stints in Japan, Korea, Greece, and Turkey. Serving overseas gave him experiences he had never imagined as a Kansas farm town boy, but it did little to erase the disturbing fantasies that had followed him since childhood. Even in the structured environment of the military, where discipline and obedience were required daily, his private imagination continued to dwell on bondage and control. Rader completed his military service in 1970 and returned home to Kansas, moving to the Wichita area. Like many returning veterans, he tried to blend back into civilian life. He enrolled at Butler County Community College, earning an associate degree in electronics, and later attended Wichita State University. Though he struggled academically, he persisted and eventually earned a degree in administration of justice in 1979. Ironically, his interest in criminal justice foreshadowed the double life he would live, a man fascinated by law enforcement who would soon use that very knowledge to evade it. In 1971, Dennis married Paula Diaz, a young woman who had been his neighbor. Paula was described by those who knew her as kind, gentle, and devoted. The marriage seemed normal from the outside, and soon they started a family together. Dennis and Paula had 2 children, a son and a daughter, and they built what looked like a stable household. They moved into a modest home in the Park City suburb of Wichita, where Dennis became deeply involved in community life. He worked a series of jobs, including at a grocery store and later as an assembler for an outdoor equipment company. By all appearances, he was the picture of the average American man, hardworking, married, and raising a family. What made Dennis Rader especially dangerous was his ability to present himself as ordinary. He was active in the Christ Lutheran Church, where he eventually became president of the church council. He was also a Boy Scout leader, guiding young boys in activities like camping and community service. To his neighbors, he was polite, reserved, and responsible. There was no reason to suspect that beneath this surface, the man they greeted on Sunday mornings was already nurturing the violent urges that had haunted him since childhood. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Dennis Rader had become a man living in 2 realities. One was the external life of stability, family, and church, a facade that gave him respect in the eyes of his community. The other was his internal world, where fantasies of control, bondage, and murder dominated his thoughts. He later admitted that by this time, he had already begun to plan how he might bring those fantasies to life. He imagined elaborate scenarios of stalking victims, binding them, and controlling them completely. For him, these fantasies were not fleeting, they were blueprints he stored for later use. The contrast between Dennis Rader's public persona and his private obsessions grew more extreme with each passing year. On one hand, he was a husband, father, church member, and future community leader. On the other hand, he was a man who carried notebooks filled with drawings of bound women who stalked neighborhoods imagining which houses could be broken into, and who rehearsed in his mind the acts of cruelty he wanted to perform. In hindsight, the clues of his darker side were always there, hidden in the shadows of his youth. His cruelty to animals, his fantasies of bondage, his social awkwardness, and his need for control all pointed toward a deeply disturbed psychology. But in the 1950s and 1960s, awareness of such warning signs was minimal. Teachers, neighbors, and even family members would have had no framework to recognize that behind the quiet, unremarkable boy named Dennis Rader was someone who would eventually become one of America's most notorious serial killers. As Dennis entered adulthood, the stage was set. His family life, church involvement, and respectable image would serve as the perfect mask for the secret persona he was preparing to unleash. The boy who once tied up cats and drew violent fantasies in his notebooks would soon transform into the man the world would come to know as BTK. Bind, torture, kill. When Dennis Rader returned home from the Air Force in 1970, he was 25 years old and ready to settle into what looked like an ordinary American life. Wichita, Kansas was growing in those years, a middle-class city filled with families, churches, and small businesses. For a man like Dennis, it was the perfect place to disappear into normality. He wasted no time in establishing himself. That same year, he met Paula Dietz, a quiet and devout woman who lived in the neighborhood. Paula had no idea that the man who courted her so politely already carried inside him disturbing fantasies that would one day make him infamous. Their marriage in 1971 seemed, on the surface, to be the beginning of a stable and happy life. Paula worked as a bookkeeper, and Dennis took on steady employment. Together, they purchased a small home in Park City, a suburb of Wichita, where they would raise 2 children. To neighbors, the Raders were the picture of suburban life. Paula was soft-spoken and dedicated to her family. Dennis was reliable, friendly, and attentive. He waved to neighbors, attended barbecues, and always maintained a polite, if slightly reserved, demeanor. But from the very beginning, Dennis was living two lives. By day, he was the husband, father, and community man. By night, he was consumed by fantasies of control, violence, and sexual domination. He began to put these fantasies into practice, not yet with murder, but with stalking. Rader prowled his own community, watching women from a distance, noting their routines, and imagining how he might one day overpower them. He called these obsessions projects. Each project involved hours of planning, studying the potential victim's home, work schedule, and vulnerabilities. This meticulous nature, born from both his military background and his personality, would later make his crimes especially difficult to detect. In 1972, Dennis found work at the Coleman Company, a manufacturer of camping equipment. The job gave him structure and responsibility, and it helped support his young family. But it also left him restless. He was ambitious, always searching for something more, and always dissatisfied. Soon after, he took night classes at Wichita State University, working toward a degree in criminal justice. Ironically, he was studying the very system that would one day hunt him down. For Dennis, however, these classes were not just about better employment opportunities. They also fed his curiosity about law enforcement techniques, surveillance, and criminal procedure. His fascination with police work was not the admiration of a law-abiding citizen. It was the curiosity of a predator, wanting to know how hunters think so he could remain hidden. Outside of work and school, Dennis built a reputation in his community. He joined the Christ Lutheran Church and quickly became a respected member. He taught Sunday school, served on committees, and eventually rose to the position of president of the church council. This involvement gave him a sense of authority and respectability. To the people who knew him, he was a moral, disciplined man devoted to faith and family. No one could have imagined that during the same period, Dennis was keeping a secret collection of bondage drawings, photographs, and written fantasies in which he imagined himself binding, torturing, and killing women. By the mid-1970s, Dennis and Paula welcomed their first child, and later a second. Fatherhood further cemented his outward image as a responsible family man. He took his children camping, attended school events, and was a reliable presence in their lives. But even in these moments of apparent normalcy, Dennis's dark urges did not subside. In fact, the stability of his home life seemed to embolden him. To him, the ordinary mask of family and community was not only protection, it was the perfect camouflage. Nobody would suspect that the father playing with his kids in the yard was also the man fantasizing about stalking women in Wichita neighborhoods. It was during this period that Rader began experimenting more aggressively with his secret fantasies. He broke into houses not to steal, but to imagine the thrill of control. He would sometimes linger in the homes of women he had targeted, taking small items or simply observing their private spaces. These acts were rehearsals for the crimes he had already decided he would one day commit. Each intrusion gave him confidence. Each project fueled the delusion that he was destined to act out his fantasies on a larger, deadlier scale. At the same time, Dennis nurtured a fascination with the idea of infamy. He studied the stories of other criminals and killers. The notion of leaving behind a name, a mark, and a legacy of fear appealed to him. Later in life, when he began communicating with the police and the media, it became clear that he did not simply want to kill. He wanted to be known. to be recognized as a force that others feared. The seeds of this desire for recognition were already present in his young adulthood. Rader's meticulous planning extended beyond his fantasies. He maintained a secret trove of what he later called hit kits, bags containing rope, tape, knives, and other tools of restraint. He would prepare these kits in advance, hiding them away until the time was right. This level of preparation showed that by the early 1970s, he was no longer just fantasizing. He was actively preparing for the moment when he would cross the line from thought to action. Yet to Paula, to his children, and to his church congregation, Dennis seemed entirely normal. His ability to compartmentalize his life was perhaps his most dangerous trait. Unlike some criminals whose behavior gives them away, Rader lived a disciplined dual existence. He could attend a church meeting in the evening, lead his children in prayer at night, and then wake up the next morning consumed with fantasies of binding and killing. He was, in essence, practicing for the role of BTK long before he acted on it. By 1973, Rader had settled into this routine of double life so deeply that it felt natural to him. He had mastered the art of appearing ordinary. He worked, studied, and cared for his family. He was friendly to neighbors and respected in his church. At the same time, he was building his identity as BTK in secret, collecting images, drawing fantasies, stalking women, and creating plans. What made this period so critical in Rader's life was the transition it represented. His childhood had been filled with disturbing fantasies and cruelty to animals. His teenage years had been marked by loneliness and hidden obsessions. But his young adulthood was the time when those obsessions became concrete. The creation of hit kits, the stalking of women, and the rehearsals of break-ins all demonstrated that he was moving closer to making his fantasies a reality. The world still saw him as Dennis Rader, husband, father, church member, and community man. But in his mind, another identity had already been born. That identity was BTK, bind, torture, kill. It was not yet known to the police or the public, but it was fully alive in him. And soon, Dennis Rader would give it a voice and a body count. On the morning of January 15, 1974, Wichita, Kansas, awoke to one of the most shocking crimes in its history. What seemed like an ordinary winter day would mark the beginning of a nightmare that would stretch across 3 decades. For Dennis Rader, this day was the moment when years of fantasies became reality. The mask of ordinary husband, father, and church man would remain in place, but behind it, the identity of BTK, bind, torture, kill, would step into the world for the first time. The targets of his first attack were the Otero family. Joseph Otero, 40 years old, was a retired Air Force sergeant who had moved his family to Wichita for a quieter life. His wife, Julie, was 33, a devoted homemaker who loved caring for her children. Together, they had 5 children, though only 4 lived at home. On that fateful January morning, their 15-year-old son, Charlie, would leave for school ahead of his siblings, unknowingly sparing his life. Inside the house remained Joseph and Julie, along with 2 of their children, Josephine, age 11, and Joseph Jr., just 9. Dennis Rader had been stalking the Otero home for weeks. He referred to his chosen victims as projects, and the Oteros had become his latest obsession. He knew their routines, their schedules, and the layout of their house. On the morning of January 15, he armed himself with a hit kit containing ropes, bindings, and a firearm, and walked to the Otero residence with one chilling purpose: to live out the fantasies that had haunted him since childhood. When Rader entered the Otero home, he confronted the family with his pistol. Calmly but firmly, he explained that he was a fugitive in need of money and a car. He promised that if they cooperated, no one would be harmed. His tone was rehearsed, meant to create the illusion of control and calm. The Oteros, frightened and uncertain, believed they were dealing with a desperate man looking for a quick escape. What they could not have known was that Rader never intended to leave them alive. He first ordered the family members into the living room, binding their hands and feet with ropes from his kit. Joseph Otero, still a military man at heart, tried to reason with him, even offering assistance if Rader would just leave his family unharmed. But Dennis was already locked into his plan. His fantasies were unfolding, and there was no turning back. The sequence of murders that followed was brutal and calculated. Rader strangled Joseph Otero first, pressing a cord tightly around his neck until the life drained from him. He then turned to Julie, the mother, binding her more tightly before taking her life in a similar fashion. His killings were not quick. He lingered, deriving a twisted satisfaction from the suffering of his victims. The children were next. 9-year-old Joseph Jr. fought desperately, struggling against the ropes, but he was no match for the man who had been rehearsing this moment for years. Finally, Rader turned to 11-year-old Josephine. He took her to the basement where he hung her from a pipe, strangling her slowly. In later confessions, he admitted that Josephine's murder gave him a disturbing sense of fulfillment. She was young, helpless, and entirely under his control, the embodiment of the fantasies that had defined his life. When it was over, 4 members of the Otero family lay dead inside their home. Rader lingered, taking time to collect personal items as souvenirs. He enjoyed the silence, the power, and the knowledge that he had carried out his plan exactly as he had imagined. For Dennis Rader, the line between fantasy and reality had been permanently crossed. Later that day, Charlie Otero returned home from school. The scene he discovered would scar him forever. He found his parents and siblings lifeless, bound and strangled, their home turned into a crime scene. His cries alerted neighbors, and soon the Wichita police were swarming the house. For the officers, the brutality was unlike anything they had seen in their community. 4 people, including 2 children, had been murdered with deliberate cruelty. The city of Wichita was stunned, and fear spread quickly through the community. Investigators worked tirelessly to piece together what had happened. They studied the bindings, the positions of the bodies, and the signs of forced control. But in 1974, forensic science was still limited. DNA technology did not yet exist, and the killer had left few clear fingerprints or clues. Detectives were baffled. The Otero murders seemed both calculated and random. There was no sign of robbery, no clear motive, and no connections that made sense. For Rader, the lack of evidence was a thrill. He watched the news coverage with fascination, taking pride in the fear and confusion he had created. In his mind, he had proven himself. He was no longer just Dennis Rader, the invisible man in the community. He was BTK, a force of terror, a shadow who could strike without warning. Yet at the same time, he could return home to his wife and children, blending seamlessly into the life of an ordinary husband and father. The murders ignited a wave of paranoia in Wichita. Families began locking their doors at night, something many had not done before. Parents warned their children about strangers, and rumors spread quickly. The idea that a killer could invade a family's home in broad daylight terrified the city. Still, no one had any idea who the perpetrator was, or that he was quietly living among them, smiling politely in the grocery store and attending church services as though nothing had happened. Rader himself later described the Otero murders as his first big event. He spoke of them not with remorse, but with a detached pride, as if he had successfully completed a project. This cold language reflected the way he viewed his victims, not as human beings with lives and families, but as objects in his personal fantasy world. For him, the killings were not the end, but the beginning. In the weeks after the murders, police continued to chase leads, interviewing neighbors, family members, and anyone with a possible connection. Yet Rader remained invisible. He went to work, attended classes, and participated in church functions. At home, Paula saw nothing unusual in her husband's behavior. He was, to her, the same quiet man she had married, devoted to family and faith. But inside Dennis Rader, something had changed forever. He had tasted the reality of murder, and it had only deepened his hunger. The Oteros were the beginning, but they would not be the last. Wichita, Kansas, had unknowingly become the hunting ground of a man who would kill again and again, taunting both the police and the public, and leaving behind a trail of fear that would last for decades. In the months following the Otero murders, Wichita police worked tirelessly to track down leads. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people, examined physical evidence, and even explored the possibility that the killings had been carried out by multiple perpetrators. Yet, despite their efforts, the investigation seemed to stall. The brutality of the crime suggested a deeply disturbed individual, but without a clear suspect, the trail grew cold. For most criminals, this silence from investigators might have offered relief. But for Dennis Rader, it sparked something else entirely: frustration. From the very beginning, Rader's killings were not only about violence. They were also about recognition. He craved acknowledgement, a desire to be seen and feared. For him, killing was not just about satisfying fantasies of control. It was about establishing an identity. And so, in late 1974, Dennis Rader made the decision that would set him apart from many other killers. He began communicating with the media and the police. In October of that year, just months after the Otero murders, a letter arrived at a Wichita television station. It described in chilling detail how the Otero family had been murdered. The author knew facts that had never been released to the public, details only the killer could know. In the letter, the writer admitted responsibility for the crime and gave himself a name: BTK, short for bind them, torture them, kill them. It was a signature that would forever be tied to Dennis Rader. The letter was not just a confession, it was a performance. Rader took pride in describing his actions with cold detachment, as if he were writing a manual on murder. He outlined his methods, emphasized his control over the victims, and mocked the police for their inability to catch him. For investigators, the letter was both a breakthrough and a nightmare. It confirmed that the Otero murders were the work of a single killer, but it also revealed that this killer was intelligent, calculating, and desperate for attention. The public reaction was immediate. News outlets reported that Wichita had a serial killer in its midst, someone who not only murdered families, but also taunted the authorities charged with stopping him. Fear spread across the city. Parents who had once allowed their children to walk freely through neighborhoods now kept them close. Locks were installed, security systems purchased, and a sense of paranoia began to settle over the community. Wichita was no longer safe. For Rader, the reaction was exactly what he wanted. He read the news stories obsessively, clipping articles and saving them in his growing collection of memorabilia. He reveled in the fact that he had become a figure of fear. To him, the name BTK was not just an alias. It was a brand, a symbol of power. Each letter he sent to the police or the media was carefully crafted, not only to boast about his crimes, but also to elevate his status. He wanted to be mentioned alongside other infamous killers. He wanted immortality through fear, In 1977, Rader struck again. On March 17, he targeted Shirley Vian, a 24-year-old mother of 3. He broke into her home, tied her up, and strangled her while her children were locked in the bathroom. Once again, he left behind a scene of horror. Later that same year, on December 8, he murdered Nancy Fox, a 25-year-old woman living alone. The killing was followed by another letter, this time sent directly to the police. In it, Rader described how he had killed Fox in chilling detail. He even called 911 to report her death, disguising his voice but leaving just enough of a trace to torment investigators. By now, it was clear that BTK was not going to stop. His killings were punctuated by his communications, each letter serving as both a confession and a challenge. In his writings, he often referred to his murders as projects, or hits, stripping away the humanity of his victims and reducing them to objects in his twisted fantasy world. He also began creating what he called his Factor X, a mysterious force he claimed drove him to kill. By blaming this supposed force, he portrayed himself not as a man making choices, but as a servant to an uncontrollable compulsion. The letters revealed something else. Dennis Rader was obsessed with control, not just of his victims, but also of the narrative surrounding his crimes. He wanted the police to chase him. He wanted the media to publish his words. He wanted the public to live in fear of his next move. This need for control mirrored the same dynamic he exercised over his victims, binding and dominating them until their lives were extinguished. Throughout the late 1970s, investigators scrambled to keep up. Wichita police formed special task forces, and the FBI offered assistance. Psychologists studied the letters, attempting to create a profile of the killer. They described him as methodical, intelligent, and likely someone who lived a double life, appearing normal while secretly feeding his violent urges. What they did not know was that their profile was frighteningly accurate. Dennis Rader was living quietly in Park City, raising his children, attending church, and working in the community, all while carrying out his secret life as BTK. For the city of Wichita, the fear was unrelenting. Each new letter was a reminder that the killer was still out there, watching, planning, and waiting. Residents speculated endlessly about who he might be. Was he a neighbor? A coworker? Someone at church? The idea that BTK could be hiding in plain sight made the fear all the more intense. By 1979, Rader's killings and communications had firmly established him as one of the most terrifying figures in Kansas history. Yet, even as police redoubled their efforts, Rader remained invisible. He continued to refine his methods, growing more confident with each successful escape. At home, his wife Paula noticed nothing unusual. His children saw only a quiet father who worked hard and participated in family life. To the outside world, he was Dennis Rader, the responsible church member and family man. But in his private world, he was BTK, feeding off fear, power, and recognition. The late 1970s marked the true emergence of the BTK persona. The Otero family had been his first victims, but it was his letters, his taunts, and his public demands for recognition that cemented his legacy of terror. He was not content with killing alone. He needed an audience. He wanted to control not just the lives he ended, but also the minds of everyone in Wichita. And in this, he succeeded. By the close of the decade, BTK was no longer just a faceless murderer. He was a name etched into the nightmares of a community, a phantom who taunted the very people sworn to protect it. For Dennis Rader, it was only the beginning. As the 1980s began, the city of Wichita was still haunted by the shadow of BTK. The letters, the taunts, and the grisly murders of the 1970s had left residents in a state of unease. Families doubled, checked their locks, installed security systems, and lived with the lingering fear that the killer could strike again at any moment. And yet, as the years passed, the murders stopped. No new bodies appeared. No new letters arrived. Slowly, the city began to breathe again. For many, it seemed as though the nightmare had ended. Perhaps the killer had been arrested for another crime. Perhaps he had moved away. Perhaps, just maybe, he was gone for good. But BTK was not gone. He was still there, quietly living in Wichita, blending seamlessly into the life of an ordinary husband, father, and community man. Dennis Rader had simply chosen to enter what he later called his cooling off period. His hunger for control and killing never truly disappeared. But he placed his violent urges on hold, channeling his energy into the respectable life he had built. By this time, Dennis had secured steady work. In 1974, the same year he committed the Otero murders, he began working for ADT Security Services, installing alarm systems in homes and businesses. The irony was chilling. The same man who had terrorized Wichita families by breaking into their homes was now earning a living installing the very systems designed to protect them. For Dennis, the job was more than just employment. It allowed him access to people's houses, insight into their vulnerabilities, and endless opportunities to fantasize about control. While his customers saw a helpful technician keeping their families safe, Dennis privately studied their homes as potential projects, filing away details for his secret world. Throughout the 1980s, Dennis continued to maintain his image as a devoted family man. His wife Paula was unaware of his past crimes, and his children knew nothing of the horrors he had committed. To them, he was simply Dad. He attended their school events, played the role of provider, and appeared every bit the ordinary suburban father. At church, he remained deeply involved, eventually becoming president of the congregation at Christ Lutheran. Members of the community saw him as reliable, devout, and trustworthy. But beneath the surface, his dark fantasies never went away. Rader admitted later that during this period, he spent countless hours indulging in bondage fantasies. He collected magazines, drew disturbing sketches, and sometimes dressed in women's clothing, binding himself and taking photographs. These secret rituals gave him temporary satisfaction, but they could not replace the thrill of real murder. In his own words, he was building pressure. Even though he was not actively killing, Dennis kept his obsession alive by continuing to stalk potential victims. He called these activities projects, or PJs, short for project. He would follow women around Wichita, studying their daily routines, watching their homes, and imagining how he might one day strike. He kept extensive notes, describing possible entry points, schedules, and weaknesses. These files became his trophies, reminders that he still held power, even if he wasn't acting on it. For Wichita law enforcement, the silence of the 1980s was both a relief and a puzzle. Task forces that had been formed to catch BTK slowly disbanded as the years passed without new leads. Detectives retired, and files were boxed away. The case was never officially closed, but it began to feel like history, a chapter that had ended without resolution. For younger residents, the name BTK became more of a cautionary tale, something whispered about, but not felt as an immediate threat. For older residents, however, the memories lingered, and the unanswered questions gnawed at the community's sense of safety. Meanwhile, Dennis Rader found new ways to assert control in his public life. By the mid-1980s, he had risen to a position of authority within his church, where he directed activities, organized events, and enforced discipline. He also became a Cub Scout leader, guiding young boys, including his own son, through camping trips and outdoor adventures. For Dennis, These roles provided him with exactly what he craved: respect, authority, and influence. He thrived on being the man others looked up to, all while hiding the fact that he was one of the most dangerous men in America. His job at ADT gave him steady income, but it also fueled his fantasies. Rader sometimes admitted that he enjoyed the irony of installing alarm systems for families who feared BTK. In his mind, he was always 2 steps ahead. They might have locked doors, alarms, and neighborhood watches, but if he chose them as a project, none of it would matter. He alone controlled the decision of who lived and who died. By the late 1980s, however, the pressure within him was beginning to build again. His self-imposed silence had lasted nearly a decade, but the fantasies never stopped. He continued to build hit kits, practice bondage scenarios on himself, and record his ideas in journals and drawings. His secret collection grew, hidden from his family, but always available to him when the cravings became too strong. One of the reasons Rader may have paused during the 1980s was practicality. He was raising young children at the time, and the responsibilities of fatherhood demanded his attention. His job required long hours, and his involvement in church and scouts filled much of his schedule. Killing took planning time and risk, things that were harder to manage while balancing the image of an active family man. But the desire never went away, and as his children grew older, he began to feel the space to act again. For Wichita, the quiet years brought hope that BTK was gone. But for Dennis Rader, the 1980s were not an end. They were an incubation. He was perfecting his mask, strengthening his double life, and keeping his fantasies alive in secret. He had not abandoned his identity as BTK. He had merely pressed pause, waiting for the right moment to return. That moment would come in the mid-1980s and continue into the early 1990s, when Rader once again emerged from the shadows. His cooling-off period had ended. Wichita was about to be reminded that BTK was still very much alive. By the mid-1980s, Dennis Rader had spent nearly a decade in relative silence. To the outside world, he was nothing more than a husband, father, church leader, and ADT employee. But inside, the pressure was building. His fantasies of bondage, control, and murder had never truly gone away. They had only been suppressed, waiting for the right moment to resurface. That moment came in 1985, when the city of Wichita would once again learn that BTK was still alive. On April 27, 1985, Rader chose his next victim, Maureen Hedge, a 53-year-old woman who lived just a few houses down from him in Park City. She was friendly, well-liked, and lived alone. To Dennis, she was a perfect project. Her proximity to his own home only heightened his twisted sense of control. That night, after attending a church function with his wife, Dennis quietly slipped away. Using one of his prepared hit kits, he broke into Hedge's home in the middle of the night. Rader strangled her to death, then committed one of his most disturbing acts. Instead of leaving her body in the house, he transported it to his church, the very place where he was a respected leader. There, he photographed her body in bondage positions, staging her like the women in his secret fantasies and drawings. To Dennis, this act was symbolic. He was not only killing, but also desecrating the sacred space that gave him his public identity. Once he was finished, he disposed of Hedge's body in a ditch by the side of the road. For Wichita police, her death initially seemed like an isolated crime. They did not yet realize BTK had returned. Rader's double life continued seamlessly. To Paula, his wife, he was still the same man, hardworking, involved with the children, and respected in the church. No one suspected that just hours before, he had murdered a neighbor and desecrated her remains in the sanctuary where they worshipped. His ability to compartmentalize his life was extraordinary. He could kill one day and mow the lawn the next, never giving away the darkness inside. A year later, in September 1986, BTK struck again. This time, his victim was Vicky Wegerle, a 28-year-old mother of two. Posing as a telephone repairman, Rader tricked his way into her home. Once inside, he attacked her, tied her up, and strangled her. He took photographs of her before fleeing the scene. Vicky's husband came home shortly afterward, discovering her body and calling police. Once again, detectives were baffled. The murder showed signs of BTK's methods, but without direct communication from the killer, they could not be certain. For Rader, the Wegerle murder was another fulfillment of his fantasies, but also a test of his control. By this point, he had killed multiple times, each murder reinforcing his sense of superiority. He believed he was outsmarting the police, outmaneuvering the city, and cementing his legacy as a name that would be feared for generations. Yet, even as he killed, he remained careful. He never revealed his identity, never left behind enough evidence to convict him. His knowledge of law enforcement practices gave him confidence. He believed he was untouchable. During this same period, Rader continued his obsession with record keeping. He meticulously documented his projects, writing descriptions, drawing sketches, and filing away photographs. These records became his trophies, reminders of the control he had exercised. They also became a way for him to relive the murders during his long periods of silence. When he could not kill, he could still revisit his archives, flipping through notes and images that transported him back into the fantasy. By the late 1980s, Dennis's children were growing older, and his role as father became less demanding. This gave him more freedom, more opportunities to act on his desires. Yet, even as he continued to stalk and fantasize, his killing slowed. After the Wegerle murder in 1986, there would not be another confirmed BTK killing until 1991. That final murder came on January 19, 1991, when Rader targeted Dolores Davis, a 62-year-old woman living just outside Wichita. Once again, he prepared his hit kit, parked his car at a distance, and approached her home on foot. Breaking in through a window, he strangled her and then transported her body to a remote location, where he posed her and took photographs before leaving her remains hidden. Dolores Davis's death was the last known murder committed by Dennis Rader. By this point, his urge to kill was colliding with the realities of his life. He was middle-aged, with more responsibilities at work and church. His family demanded attention, and his position in the community continued to grow. Balancing his double life was becoming harder. And so, after 1991, Rader entered another long silence. For Wichita police, the murders of the mid-1980s and early 1990s were deeply troubling. They bore the hallmarks of BTK, but without letters or direct communication, certainty remained elusive. Detectives were hesitant to confirm his return publicly, fearing that it would reignite panic in the city. And so, for years, the cases of Hedge, Wegerle, and Davis remained unsolved mysteries, quietly filed away with the haunting possibility that BTK was still among them. For the community, the fear lingered, but time dulled the intensity. The 1970s had been a decade of horror, defined by BTK's letters and taunts. The 1980s and early 1990s were quieter, the murders less frequent, the communications absent. Some believed BTK had been imprisoned for another crime. Others speculated he had died or simply moved away. Few imagined that he was still living in Park City, still attending church, still smiling politely at neighbors, all while hiding the truth that he was one of America's most notorious serial killers. For Dennis Rader, these years represented the peak of his double life. He had successfully balanced the roles of father, husband, church leader, and scoutmaster with the role of serial killer. He had killed neighbors, mothers, and strangers, all while maintaining the image of a respectable man. And though his killings would stop after 1991, the identity of BTK did not vanish. It remained alive in his fantasies, in his records, and in his growing arrogance. What no one knew was that his silence was temporary. Though he would not kill again, his desire for recognition never went away. And more than a decade later, that desire for acknowledgement, for infamy, for control would become his undoing. After the murder of Dolores Davis in 1991, Dennis Rader, the BTK Killer, vanished once again. The man who had haunted Wichita for nearly 2 decades simply disappeared from the headlines. There were no new bodies, no new letters, and no signs that the city's most terrifying predator was still active. For Wichita residents, it was as though a curtain had dropped on a nightmare. The community, though scarred, began to heal. But Dennis Rader had not disappeared. He was still there, living in Park City, Kansas. He had simply chosen to enter another cooling-off period, one that would last more than a decade. For Rader, this silence was not an end but a shift. He stopped killing, but he never stopped being BTK. During these years, Dennis embraced his public identity more than ever. He became deeply involved in his church, Christ Lutheran, where he had already held positions of leadership. In the 1990s, he was elected president of the congregation, a role that gave him authority and visibility. For parishioners, he was the model of devotion, punctual, reliable, and always willing to volunteer. Few could imagine that the man who led prayers on Sunday mornings was the same man who had bound, tortured, and killed their neighbors in secret. At home, Dennis played the role of devoted husband and father. His daughter Carrie and son Brian were growing older, moving through high school and into adulthood. Rader attended their activities, supported their interests, and gave every appearance of being a family man. To his wife Paula, he was strict but dependable. She had no reason to suspect the horrors of his past, even though she sometimes noticed his odd behaviors. His need for control, his rigid rules, and his private hobbies that he never fully explained. Those hobbies, of course, were the continuation of his secret life. Though he had stopped killing, Rader's fantasies never left him. In the privacy of his home, he indulged in self-bondage sessions, photographing himself in elaborate disguises and poses. He wore masks, wigs, and women's clothing, binding himself with ropes and chains, and capturing the scenes on film. These photos became a hidden archive, a way for him to relive the thrill of control without leaving victims behind. For Rader, it was a substitute, a way to feed the hunger without risking exposure. He also maintained his files on potential projects. Rader continued to stalk women, taking notes about their routines, sketching their homes, and imagining how he might one day strike. He labeled these files PJs, short for projects, a term he had used since the beginning of his killing career. Some of these women were never attacked, but the act of studying and documenting them satisfied part of his compulsion. He needed to know that he could still choose, that he still had the power to decide life and death. Even if he never acted on it again, professionally, Dennis took on a new role in 1991 when he became a compliance officer for Park City. In this job, he enforced municipal codes, handling issues like stray dogs, unkempt lawns, and zoning violations. It was a small position in a small community, but for Rader, it was perfect. It gave him authority, a badge, and the chance to exercise control over others. Residents soon came to know him as a strict and sometimes harsh enforcer of the rules. Some even called him Little Hitler, behind his back, a reference to his authoritarian style. What they did not know was that his need for control in his job mirrored the same impulses that had driven his murders. Meanwhile, the BTK case grew colder with each passing year. Detectives who had worked tirelessly in the 1970s and 1980s retired or moved on to other assignments. Files were stored away, evidence shelved, and task forces disbanded. While the cases remained officially open, the lack of new activity meant that few resources were dedicated to pursuing them. For a new generation of Wichita residents, the name BTK became more legend than reality, an urban myth told by parents who remembered the fear of the 1970s. But for survivors and victims' families, the silence was anything but comforting. They lived with unanswered questions. They wondered if the killer had died, been imprisoned for another crime, or simply chosen to stop. They had no closure, no justice, only the lingering shadow of a predator who had never been caught. For Rader himself, the long silence became a point of pride. He believed he had beaten the system. He had killed 10 people, taunted the police, and then melted back into society without ever being caught. His arrogance grew with each passing year. He believed he was too smart, too careful, too disciplined to ever be exposed. He convinced himself that his legacy as BTK was secure, even if his crimes remained officially unsolved. Yet beneath his confidence lay a gnawing dissatisfaction. Rader craved recognition. He wanted credit for his work. He wanted the world to remember BTK not as an unsolved mystery, but as a name carved into the annals of serial killer history. To him, silence meant obscurity, and obscurity was intolerable. Through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, this tension grew. On the surface, Dennis lived the life of a respectable man, a church leader, a father, a city employee. But in private, his fantasies continued. His self-bondage sessions expanded, and his desire for acknowledgement simmered. He had constructed a life that hid his crimes, but he also longed to reveal himself, to prove that he had outsmarted everyone. By 2004, more than 3 decades after his first murders, that longing would finally overpower his caution. After years of silence, Dennis Rader could no longer resist the urge to speak again. He would reawaken BTK, reaching out to the media and police with new letters, new puzzles, and new boasts. In doing so, he would reignite the terror of the past and set in motion the chain of events that would finally bring him down. For more than a decade, Dennis Rader had lived in silence. The murders of the 1970s and early 1990s had faded into memory, the BTK case relegated to old files and unsolved mysteries. Many in Wichita believed the killer was dead, imprisoned, or simply gone. But in 2004, after nearly 30 years since his first crime, the BTK Killer suddenly reawakened. It began quietly, almost like a whisper from the past. In March 2004, the Wichita Eagle, the city's main newspaper, published a story marking the 30th anniversary of the Otero family murders. The article revisited the case, reminding readers of the horror that had once gripped their community and noting that BTK had never been caught. For Dennis Rader, reading this was intolerable. His crimes, his name, his identity as BTK, reduced to a cold case article. To him, this was erasure. He had spent decades carefully crafting his legacy as a killer who bound, tortured, and killed. And now his story was being forgotten. Rader's ego could not allow that. In his mind, BTK was not just a killer. He was an artist of death, a figure who deserved recognition. And so, he decided to step back into the light. On March 17, 2004, a package was discovered at the Wichita Public Library. Inside was a photocopy of Vicki Wiggerl's driver's license, stolen from her at the time of her 1986 murder, and several photographs of her body. Alongside these items was a note claiming responsibility for her death. Until that moment, police had never confirmed Wiggerl as a BTK victim. Now, after 18 years, the killer himself had spoken. The package stunned investigators. For decades, they had waited in vain for BTK to resurface. Now, out of nowhere, he was back. The materials were authentic, leaving no doubt that the sender was the real BTK. Wichita was thrown into a frenzy. Fear, which had long been dormant, returned almost overnight. Residents locked their doors tighter, watched their neighborhoods more closely, and whispered about the killer who had come back to haunt them. And Rader wasn't done. Over the next year, he sent a series of letters, packages, and puzzles to police and media outlets. Each one contained taunts, confessions, and disturbing artifacts. In one package, he included a doll with its hands and feet bound, placed inside a cereal box labeled Post Toasties. The symbolism was grotesque, mocking, and unmistakable. In another, he sent a word puzzle, challenging investigators to decipher his hidden messages. These communications revealed the same arrogant, controlling personality that had defined BTK from the beginning. He needed the world to know he was still out there. He wanted credit for his work. And above all, he wanted to control the narrative. Every letter, every package was designed to keep police and the public dancing to his tune. But what Rader did not realize was that the world had changed since his first letters in the 1970s. Technology had advanced. DNA testing, computer forensics, and digital tracking gave investigators tools they had never had before. Rader, confident in his own intelligence, underestimated these changes. His arrogance would soon lead to the mistake that exposed him. In January 2005, BTK sent another package to a local television station. This time, he included a message asking police a critical question. Could a floppy disk be traced back to its source? Or was it safe to send one without being identified? In the message, he asked police to respond through a coded notice in the newspaper. Investigators, seeing an opportunity, told him what he wanted to hear. Through a public statement hidden in a classified ad, they assured him that a floppy disk would be safe. Rader believed them. In February 2005, he mailed a purple floppy disk to a local TV station. On the disk was a document titled Test, containing some of his writings. But what Rader didn't know was that every floppy disk contains metadata, digital fingerprints that reveal its origin. Investigators quickly extracted the data. The disk had been last saved by a user named Dennis at Christ Lutheran Church. The walls closed in almost immediately. Detectives focused on Dennis Rader, a 60-year-old compliance officer living in Park City. He was married, had 2 children, and was a respected church leader. On the surface, he was the very image of normalcy, but the metadata pointed directly to him. Combined with his residence in the Wichita area during all the killings, the circumstantial evidence became overwhelming. To confirm their suspicions, investigators secretly obtained a DNA sample from Rader's daughter, Carrie, through medical records. When compared to evidence collected from BTK crime scenes decades earlier, the match was undeniable. The father of Carrie Rader was the BTK Killer. Dennis Rader's arrogance had finally betrayed him. The floppy disk, which he believed was untraceable, had led police straight to his door. For 30 years he had hidden in plain sight, and yet it was a simple piece of digital evidence that unraveled everything. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was pulled over by police while driving his black Jeep Cherokee. Calm, collected, and seemingly unsurprised, he was taken into custody. When asked by officers if he knew why he was being arrested, Rader replied with a chilling calmness, "Oh, I have suspicions." After decades of terror, Wichita finally had its answer. BTK was not dead. He had not disappeared. He had been living among them the entire time, leading church meetings, enforcing city codes and smiling politely at neighbors. Now his mask was shattered. When Dennis Rader was arrested on February 25, 2005, the city of Wichita was stunned. For 3 decades, the BTK Killer had been a ghost, a faceless predator whose crimes had haunted the community and baffled law enforcement. Now, the man behind the mask was revealed, and he was nothing like the monster most people had imagined. He was not a drifter, not a recluse, not an outsider lurking in the shadows. He was a 60-year-old family man, a church president, a former scout leader, and the local compliance officer who wrote tickets for overgrown lawns. The revelation shook Wichita to its core. Neighbors who had known Dennis Rader for years were stunned. They remembered him as strict, perhaps a little odd, but always polite and dependable. Families who had invited him into their homes when he worked for ADT couldn't comprehend that he had been casing their houses as potential crime scenes. Fellow church members who had prayed alongside him were horrified to realize that their congregation president was the same man who had murdered 10 people in their city. Rader's arrest was just the beginning. Detectives now faced the task of getting him to talk, to confirm what they already suspected. At first, Dennis tried to play coy. He asked investigators, "How many people do you think I've killed?" He dangled information, toying with them as he always had. But soon his need for recognition, the same arrogance that had led to his capture, took over. Within hours of interrogation, Dennis Rader began to confess. He did not shout, cry, or beg. Instead, he spoke calmly, methodically, almost clinically, as if reciting a work log. He detailed each of his 10 murders, describing how he chose his victims, how he planned the attacks, and how he carried them out. Detectives were stunned at the cold precision of his storytelling. There was no remorse in his words, no grief, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. For Rader, this was his moment to cement his legacy. He wanted to ensure that the world understood how clever, how careful, and how powerful he had been. His confessions matched crime scene evidence perfectly. He admitted to killing the Otero family in 1974, describing how he cut the phone line, entered the house, and methodically bound each family member before strangling them. He explained the Josephine Otero hanging in chilling detail, recalling how he staged her body for his own gratification. He confessed to the murders of Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, and the others, recounting each crime with disturbing accuracy. For investigators who had worked these cases for decades, hearing the killer himself finally confirm the details was both vindicating and horrifying. What made Rader's confession so unsettling was his tone. He did not speak as a man burdened by guilt or haunted by nightmares. He spoke as though he were proud of his efficiency, like an employee reporting a job well done. He used terms like projects and hits instead of murders. He described victims not as human beings, but as objects of his fantasy, tools for his need to bind, torture, and kill. During his interrogations, Rader also revealed the obsessive documentation he had kept for decades. He had written detailed notes, drawn sketches, and stored photographs of himself in bondage poses. He had hidden these materials in what he called his mother lode, an archive of his secret life. This collection, discovered by police in his home, provided further proof of his crimes and his twisted inner world. It also showed that even during his long cooling-off periods, BTK never truly disappeared. His fantasies had continued, meticulously catalogued, waiting for the day he could relive them in memory or in reality. On March 1, 2005, Dennis Rader appeared in court for the first time. Shackled and wearing an orange jumpsuit, he looked nothing like the terrifying figure who had once dominated Wichita's nightmares. He looked like an aging bureaucrat, unremarkable and ordinary. Yet beneath that appearance was the mind of a sadistic killer who had managed to evade justice for 30 years. At his arraignment, prosecutors charged him with 10 counts of first-degree murder. As the list of victims was read aloud, names that had haunted Wichita for decades. Family members sat in the courtroom, finally face to face with the man who had stolen their loved ones. Some wept quietly. Others stared at him in disbelief. Rader showed little emotion. For him, the attention was almost welcome. Over the following weeks, investigators continued to piece together the timeline of his crimes. They interviewed neighbors, coworkers, and church members, all of whom expressed shock. They uncovered his writings, his sketches, his trophies. Every piece of evidence painted a picture of a man who had lived a double life with frightening success. A family man on the surface, a killer in the shadows. Perhaps most disturbing of all was Rader's demeanor. He cooperated with investigators, not out of guilt, but because he wanted his story told. He corrected details when police got them wrong. He explained his methods as though giving a tutorial. He even bragged about his ability to control victims and manipulate situations. For him, the confessions were not an act of atonement. They were his final stage, the moment when BTK could reclaim the spotlight and etch his name into history. By the time Dennis Rader stood trial in June 2005, the case against him was overwhelming. The DNA evidence, the floppy disk metadata, his confessions, and the trove of materials found in his home left no room for doubt. He faced the weight of the justice system, but he also faced something else: the families of his victims. In court, many of them prepared to confront the man who had destroyed their lives. For the first time, BTK was no longer in control. But before judgment could be passed, Rader would make one more move that shocked the world. He would stand before the court and give a detailed, hour-long account of every murder he committed. Calm, precise, and horrifyingly detached. In June 2005, Dennis Rader stood before the Sedgwick County District Court, no longer the faceless BTK killer, but an ordinary man in shackles. What came next would be one of the most chilling moments in American courtroom history. Asked by the judge to enter his plea, Rader did not hesitate. He calmly said the words, "Guilty, Your Honor." But it wasn't just the plea that shook those in the courtroom. It was the way he delivered it, without hesitation, without remorse, and with the same detached precision that had defined his crimes. The guilty plea required Rader to describe each murder in detail, and he embraced the opportunity. For over an hour, he recounted the killings one by one as though he were reading from a work journal. He explained how he selected his victims, how he prepared his hit kits, how he broke into homes, and how he bound, tortured, and killed. His voice was calm, steady, and disturbingly matter-of-fact. To him, these were not confessions of sins, but presentations of achievements. Family members of the victims sat in the courtroom, listening in horror as he described their loved ones' final moments. The coldness of his tone only deepened their grief. Rader spoke of strangulation as if it were a mechanical process. He described victims not as people, but as projects. He even corrected himself when he misstated a minor detail, as though accuracy in reporting were more important than acknowledging human suffering. For the families, hearing him recount the deaths in such a clinical manner was like ripping open old wounds that had never fully healed. The judge, hardened by years of legal experience, was visibly shaken. Prosecutors, too, were struck by the chilling detachment of the killer. One remarked later that Rader seemed to view the courtroom as his stage, his final opportunity to cement his legacy as BTK. And in a twisted way, he was right. The entire nation was watching. On August 18, 2005, sentencing day arrived. The courtroom was packed with family members, survivors, journalists, and law enforcement officers who had spent decades chasing a ghost. In Kansas at the time, the death penalty was not available, meaning Rader would not face execution. Instead, he was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms, one for each victim, ensuring that he would never walk free again. Before the sentence was handed down, families were given the chance to speak. They delivered emotional victim impact statements, confronting Rader directly. They spoke of stolen lives, broken families, and the decades of fear and grief that had defined their existence. Some wept as they described the pain of losing loved ones. Others expressed anger, demanding that Rader face the consequences of his cruelty. Throughout it all, Rader sat quietly, sometimes dabbing his eyes with a tissue, but never showing genuine remorse. His tears seemed less for his victims and more for himself. When he did address the court, his words rang hollow. He apologized in a monotone voice, claiming he was guided by a compulsion he could not control. But his apology lacked sincerity, and the families saw it for what it was. Another performance, another attempt to manage his image. After the sentencing, Dennis Rader was transferred to El Dorado Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison in Kansas. There, he began his life behind bars. Stripped of his freedom, his job, his church, and his family, he became inmate 2083707. For the first time, Dennis Rader no longer had control. His world shrank to a cell, his legacy to the title of BTK Killer. In prison, Rader's behavior reflected the same need for order and control that had defined his life outside. He followed routines strictly, kept his cell meticulously organized, and occasionally communicated with outsiders through letters. These letters revealed that even in confinement, he still sought attention, still wanted to shape the narrative of his crimes. He offered to help criminologists understand his psychology, describing his murders as though they were case studies. In truth, it was another way for him to maintain the spotlight. For his family, the revelation of his double life was devastating. His wife, Paula, immediately filed for divorce, which was granted quickly under Kansas law due to the extreme circumstances. His children, blindsided by the truth, were left to reconcile the father they had loved with the monster the world now knew. Carrie, his daughter, later spoke publicly about the pain of discovering her father's secret identity, describing it as a betrayal so deep that it shattered her sense of reality. For Wichita, the capture and sentencing of Dennis Rader brought both relief and sorrow. Relief that the man who had terrorized the community for decades was finally behind bars. Sorrow that he had lived among them for so long, hidden in plain sight, fooling everyone. The case became a grim reminder of how ordinary a monster could appear. The legacy of the BTK Killer is a dark one. His crimes are studied in criminology and psychology programs, not only for their brutality, but for the chilling way he balanced his double life. He is often cited as an example of the organized offender, a killer who plans meticulously, controls his victims, and evades capture through careful concealment. Yet what makes his story most haunting is not just his methods, but the fact that for 30 years he lived as a neighbor, a co-worker, and a church leader, hiding unimaginable evil behind a mask of normalcy. Today, Dennis Rader remains in prison, serving out his life sentences. He is an old man now, far removed from the days when he prowled Wichita's neighborhoods and stalked his victims. But his crimes continue to cast a long shadow. For the families of the victims, there is no closure, only the knowledge that the man responsible will never harm anyone again. For Wichita, the scars remain, a reminder that evil can wear a friendly face and live just down the street. In the end, Dennis Rader wanted to be remembered. He wanted the world to know the name BTK, to fear it, to study it. And while he succeeded in etching that name into history, his legacy is not one of power or control, but of cowardice, cruelty, and betrayal. He will be remembered not as the master criminal he imagined himself to be, but as a sadistic killer who destroyed lives and families only to be undone by his own arrogance.